Okay, so now in this lecture, we're going to talk about some of the different processes that can occur upon absorption of light for a single molecule, and this is described by the Jablonski diagram. So the Jablonski diagram is going to tell us about many of the possible transitions that a molecule can undergo when it absorbs a certain photon. Depending on that wavelength of photon, there will be different sorts of transitions that can be accomplished. So essentially, Jablonski diagram is giving us a description of energy transfer when molecules absorb photons and then release energy through different mechanisms. Now, please do not think that these numbers here, 1 through 10, are in any sort of chronological order. I'm simply using them so we can label the different processes that a molecule can undergo. And one molecule would not undergo all 10 of these processes at once. But if you have a solution or collection of molecules, some in that population will undergo certain emission routes while others simply release heat, and we're going to describe those below.